The first shockwave. The galaxy trembled. Across the vastness of space, a strange force rippled through the stars. Planets that had never known fear now felt their surface shudder. The once stable orbits of moons twisted, sending alarm signals through countless systems. Something was happening, but no one knew what it was. It wasn't just a minor disturbance. It was a warning. The Dominus was coming. On the planet of Velaris, Commander Lena Jorik stood before the Galactic Council, a mixture of confusion and fear on the faces of the room's leaders. For years, humanity had been preparing, quietly building, hidden from the galaxy's prying eyes. Their allies had long forgotten the power of Earth's people, dismissing them as weak and insignificant. But this quake, this strange tremor that shook the stars, changed everything. "It's impossible," muttered a seasoned diplomat from the Siler Empire, his voice cracking with disbelief. "No one has the technology to cause such ripples across the galaxy. Not even the Xoreth." Lena, a woman of few words, spoke with the calm assurance that had made her one of the few human leaders trusted by the galaxy's most powerful factions. "It's not the Xoreth," she said, her eyes cold and hard. "It's humanity. Our time has come." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The council shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Dominus, the warship, the hidden weapon, was no longer a myth. It was real. The Xoreth Empire had been growing, swallowing planet after planet, its massive warships tearing apart everything in their path. The galaxy had not seen an enemy like this before. The Xoreth were known for their brutality and advanced weaponry, and for decades they had wiped out every civilization that stood in their way. But humanity, known for their resilience, had been secretly preparing to face this threat. For years, Earth had been building the Dominus, a warship that could match the sheer power of the Xoreth Armada. Hidden beneath layers of secrecy, Earth had quietly constructed the largest, most powerful warship ever seen in the galaxy, capable of delivering unimaginable destruction. The ship was designed to be humanity's response, not just to the Xoreth, but to the galaxy's growing skepticism of Earth's strength. Lena turned her attention to the large display screen at the front of the room. It showed the massive fleet of the Xoreth Empire approaching a nearby system. Their ships were enormous, monstrous vessels, each capable of eradicating entire civilizations. They were on the move again, and it was only a matter of time before they would set their sights on Earth. The leaders of the council exchanged glances. They knew the Xoreth would be unstoppable. For years, they had avoided any serious conflict with them, hoping the enemy would eventually turn their sights elsewhere. But the Xoreth had shown no mercy, and their bloodlust only seemed to grow. The galaxy was powerless in the face of such an enemy. Lena knew it was time for humanity to make its stand. "We will face them head-on," she said, her voice steady. "The Dominus is ready. We have the power to fight back." Across the galaxy, whispers began to spread. Humanity was no longer hiding in the shadows. The Dominus was coming. Far from the council chamber, in the heart of the Dominus, Captain Thorne stood in the command center, his hands resting on the control panels. The ship's systems were active, humming with energy, but there was a sense of calm. The Dominus was built for this moment, for the storm that was coming. Thorne had been through many battles, but nothing like this. The Xoreth Empire was a force to be reckoned with, and even the Dominus would have to stretch its limits to survive. Still, Thorne wasn't afraid. He had seen what humans could do when pushed to their limits. They could be as fierce as any other species in the galaxy, perhaps more so. "Captain," a voice said from behind him. It was Lieutenant Mara, one of the ship's top engineers. "We're ready for departure. The engines are primed." Thorne nodded, his face grim. "It's time." The Dominus slowly lifted off from its hidden docking station, deep within the moon of Xoreth. Its engines roared to life, sending ripples through space. The warship was a behemoth, over 10 times the size of any other ship in the galaxy, and as it began to move, the surrounding stars seemed to fade into the distance. As the ship moved through space, Captain Thorne's mind raced. The crew of the Dominus was the best humanity had to offer. Engineers, soldiers, pilots, all had been carefully selected and trained for this mission. But even with all their training, the unknown lay ahead. The Xoreth were ruthless. Would humanity's warship be enough? Would it survive the war that was about to come? In the vastness of space, an answer was coming. And the Dominus would lead the charge. Back on Velaris, the Council debated. They knew the coming conflict would decide the fate of the galaxy. But there was a new sense of hope in their hearts. Humanity had something the galaxy had never seen before, a weapon that could change everything. The Dominus was not just a ship. It was a symbol that the galaxy was not alone. As the first shockwave of the Dominus moved through space, the galaxy held its breath. The call to arms. The tension in the air was palpable as the Dominus glided silently through the stars. It was more than just a ship. It was the embodiment of humanity's determination. As the vast warship made its way toward the battlefront, Captain Thorne stood at the helm, his hands gripping the controls with steady precision. Around him, the crew readied themselves for the storm that was coming. Inside the command center, the air was filled with the low hum of the ship's systems powering up. Officer Murrah was busy at her station, running checks on all the ship's systems. The Dominus was no ordinary ship. It was a living entity, designed with the most advanced technology humanity had ever created. Its engines hummed like a sleeping giant, its weapon systems were locked and ready, and its shields were nearly invulnerable. Thorne's mind raced. The Xoreth fleet, vast and powerful, was advancing. They had no idea that humanity had been hiding its most powerful weapon. When the Xoreth ships reached their target system, they would expect an easy victory, as they always had. But humanity would surprise them. Captain, Mara's voice interrupted his thoughts. We've received word from Velaris. The Galactic Council is prepared to back us up. But they're unsure if the Dominus can stand against the Xoreth alone. Thorne turned, looking at her with unwavering resolve. They don't have to worry about us. We've trained for this moment. Humanity's strength is more than just our weapons. It's in our spirit. We'll fight till the last breath. Mara nodded, but her face was etched with concern. She knew what was at stake. If the Dominus failed, it would mean the end of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. There would be no going back. On Velaris, the Galactic Council had their doubts. For years, they had tried to maintain peace with the Xoreth Empire, believing that their might was unbeatable. They had underestimated humanity. Again. But now, there was no more room for hesitation. The Xoreth were closing in, and the Dominus was humanity's final chance. Lena Jorek paced in the council chamber, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. She had placed her faith in Captain Thorne and his crew. Now there was no turning back. We will fight, Lena declared, her voice resolute. The Dominus is not just a warship. It is humanity's defiance against a galaxy that has forgotten us. We stand with them, or we fall together. Across the room, several council members exchanged nervous glances. Some were still unsure, but others nodded in agreement. The Xoreth had never been defeated. But if humanity was to survive, it was time to make a stand. The orders were given. The galaxy would rise to fight the invaders. But the question remained, could the Dominus truly turn the tide? Back on the Dominus, the crew was preparing for their first real taste of battle. Lieutenant Mara moved swiftly through the corridors, checking on the crew members, offering brief words of encouragement, and ensuring everything was in place. This would be their first true test. There would be no room for mistakes. The soldiers were at their posts, preparing for combat. They knew that the Dominus was humanity's last hope, and they would do whatever it took to protect it. The warship was a fortress, but it wasn't invincible. The Xoreth were relentless, and their numbers were staggering. However, humanity had something the Xoreth did not: unity. As the Dominus neared the battlefront, the crew could see the vastness of the Xoreth fleet on the horizon. Dozens of enormous ships loomed in the distance, their hulls dark and foreboding against the starry expanse of space. They were ready for war, and they had no mercy. Captain Thorne's voice crackled over the ship's comms. "This is it, everyone. Prepare for battle." The crew nodded, their faces grim but determined. The Dominus was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of human resolve. A symbol that, against all odds, humanity would stand tall and fight. "All stations, report." Thorne's voice rang through the command center. "Shields up, Captain. Weapons locked and loaded," Mara responded. "Engines primed and ready," another crew member called out. The ship rumbled as it entered combat range. The Xoreth fleet, massive and unyielding, waited, ready to strike. Thorne stood tall, his mind focused. This was the moment that would define everything. There was no turning back now. Humanity had been underestimated for far too long. And now, they would make their stand. "Fire at will," Thorne commanded. The Dominus fired its first shots, and the galaxy trembled once again. This was only the beginning, but humanity had already made its mark on the battlefield. The battle for the galaxy had begun. Enter the battlefield. The Dominus hurtled through space, its colossal form cutting through the stars like a beast unleashed. As Captain Thorne stood on the bridge, his sharp eyes tracked the massive Xoreth fleet closing in on their position. His hands gripped the controls, every fiber of his being focused. The fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders, but he knew he wasn't alone. The crew of the Dominus was prepared. They had trained for this moment. "Approaching enemy fleet, Captain," Lieutenant Mara called out from her station. Her fingers moved quickly across the controls, adjusting the ship's trajectory as they moved closer to the Xoreth. On the display screen, the enemy ships grew larger, their dark shapes blocking out the stars as they formed a massive wall of steel. "All stations, report in," Thorne commanded, his voice steady, though inside he could feel the tension mounting. The crew responded with their standard readiness reports, but each one felt heavier as they neared the battle. "Shields holding steady at full power," one crew member said. "Weapon systems are ready to engage," another added. Thorne nodded grimly. This was it. No more time for preparation or second-guessing. The Dominus was humanity's most advanced warship, but the Xoreth were ruthless, and their numbers were overwhelming. The odds were stacked against them, but Thorne had something that Xoreth didn't. He had humanity's will to survive. "Brace yourselves," Thorne said, his eyes narrowing as he saw the first wave of Xoreth warships charge forward, their massive energy cannons aimed directly at the Dominus. The first shots rang out, bright streaks of light slicing through space. The Dominus shuddered under the assault, but its shields absorbed the impact. Thorne gritted his teeth as the ship lurched forward, ready to retaliate. "Return fire," Thorne barked. The Dominus's guns roared to life. Energy blasts surged from the warship's weapons, lighting up the darkness of space. The first few shots hit their targets, causing massive explosions to erupt from the Xoreth vessels. But the Xoreth didn't falter. They were relentless, pouring everything they had into the battle. Their ships were monstrous, designed for sheer power, and they showed no signs of slowing down. "Keep up the fire," Thorne shouted. "Target their flagship." The crew worked in unison, locking onto the Xoreth flagship, the largest and most formidable of their fleet. It was an enormous vessel, heavily armored and bristling with weapons. The battle was going to be fierce, but Thorne could see the Xoreth's weakness. They were powerful, but they lacked the coordination that humanity's forces had. The Dominus's precision and firepower could turn the tide, if they could keep up the pressure. "All guns, fire at will," Thorne commanded. The Dominus unleashed a storm of firepower, and the Xoreth flagship began to take damage. Explosions rocked its hull as the energy blasts tore through its shields, but the enemy wasn't done yet. They retaliated with a barrage of missiles, and the Dominus shook violently as several hit its outer layers. "Shields down to 75%, Captain," Mara called out. "We can't take many more of those," one of the engineers shouted. Thorn didn't flinch. He had faced impossible odds before, and this was no different. "Activate the countermeasures," he ordered. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Get us closer to their formation. We need to break their lines." The Dominus responded, its massive form twisting and turning in space, dodging incoming fire as it charged toward the heart of the Xoreth fleet. The warship's powerful engines pushed it forward, and the crew felt the force of every movement. It was a dangerous game, but it was humanity's best shot. "Captain, the Xoreth are deploying reinforcements," Mara shouted as a new wave of enemy ships appeared on the scanners. They were relentless, each new wave seeming to be more numerous than the last. "All hands, brace for impact," Thorn called out. The Dominus was now in the thick of it, surrounded on all sides by the monstrous Xoreth fleet. The sounds of battle echoed through the ship as every crew member worked in perfect synchronization, firing weapons, maintaining shields, and keeping the ship intact. The roar of battle filled the air, but Captain Thorn stayed focused, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any opening. The crew worked tirelessly, coordinating their efforts, firing at the Xoreth with deadly precision. The Dominus was a fortress, but it was no match for sheer numbers. The Xoreth ships kept coming, wave after wave, pushing humanity's warship to its limits. Then, a massive explosion rocked the ship. The lights flickered, and the entire bridge was filled with a harsh red glow. Thorn's knuckles turned white as he held the controls tightly, trying to steady the ship. "Mara, what's our status?" Thorn demanded. "Shields are weakening, Captain. We need to get out of the line of fire." "Not yet," Thorn replied. "We're staying here until we break through. Keep pushing." The crew could feel the Dominus straining under the assault. Every moment felt like an eternity. The Xoreth were no longer just attacking. They were hunting. But humanity wasn't ready to give up. They were strong, and the Dominus was humanity's last stand. As the battle raged on, Captain Thorn knew one thing: they couldn't afford to fail. Not now. The fight for the galaxy had just begun, and the Dominus was the only thing standing between humanity and total destruction. The power of humanity's warship. The Dominus groaned under the strain of the battle. Captain Thorn's fingers were locked on the command console, sweat beading on his forehead as he maneuvered the warship through the hail of enemy fire. The Xoreth fleet was relentless, their warships forming a nearly impenetrable wall. The Dominus had taken some hits, but its strength was undeniable. Humanity's warship was a fortress, and it wasn't backing down. "Shields holding at 50%, Captain," Lieutenant Mara shouted over the noise of the battle. Her eyes were glued to the scanners, watching as the Xoreth continued their assault. The crew was working non-stop, firing weapons, monitoring systems, and making sure the ship stayed intact. But even with the Dominus's advanced technology, the battle was wearing them down. "We need to break through their lines," Thorn said, his voice tight with determination. He knew that if they didn't act soon, the Dominus wouldn't last much longer. "Prepare the experimental weapons. If we can't push through, we'll have to take a different approach." The Dominus had been designed for this moment. Its main weaponry was formidable, but it had something far more powerful: the arc cannons, a set of experimental weapons that could pierce even the most advanced enemy shields. They had never been used in combat before, until now. "Captain, the arc cannons are ready," Mara said, her voice full of resolve. She glanced up from her station, her expression serious. "But we only have enough power for one shot. Make it count." Thorn nodded. He had no intention of wasting it. He turned to the tactical officer. "Target the largest Xoreth warship. Fire at will when locked." The Dominus's weapons system hummed with energy as the arc cannons powered up. The crew could feel the ship vibrate as the weapon charged, its massive power pooling within the ship's core. The Xoreth were closing in, but Thorn knew this was their only chance to turn the tide. The tactical officer's voice crackled through the comms. Target locked. Firing in 3, 2, 1. With a deafening roar, the arc cannons unleashed their full power. A massive beam of pure energy shot from the front of the Dominus, cutting through space with blistering speed. The beam collided with the Lid Xorath warship, and the result was immediate. The massive enemy vessel exploded in a brilliant flash of light, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The Xorath ships scattered, some falling back while others tried to regroup, but the damage was done. Direct hit. The enemy flagship is down, the tactical officer shouted, a note of awe in his voice. The crew erupted in cheers, but Captain Thorne didn't allow himself a moment of relief. This was only the beginning. The Xorath were shaken, but they wouldn't give up so easily. As the remnants of their flagship drifted into space, a new wave of Xorath ships emerged from the shadows, more determined than ever. "Prepare for the next wave," Thorne commanded, his voice steady. "We've given them a taste of what we can do, but now we finish this. We can't let up." The Dominus moved forward, its weapons firing again. The arc cannons had given them a momentary advantage, but it wouldn't be enough to win the battle. Thorne could see that now. The Xorath were learning, adapting. They were relentless, and every moment the Dominus stayed in the line of fire was a moment they were one step closer to being overwhelmed. "We need to break their formation," Thorne said. "Mara, prepare the ship for evasive maneuvers. Let's create some space." The Dominus weaved between the remaining Xorath ships, dodging incoming fire while returning blasts with pinpoint accuracy. The Xorath, enraged by the loss of their flagship, pressed forward. But humanity wasn't giving up. The Dominus's weapons tore through their lines, one ship after another falling to its firepower. As the battle raged on, Thorne knew that they could not afford to tire. Every moment counted. The Xorath had superior numbers, but humanity had something more: determination. They had proven that they could fight. Now it was time to prove that they could win. "Captain, the enemy is retreating," Mara shouted, her voice filled with relief. Thorne's eyes never left the view of the battle unfolding before him. The Xorath were retreating, but Thorne knew better than to celebrate just yet. This wasn't over. The Xorath were smart. They would regroup and come back stronger. But humanity had taken its first major victory. "Keep pushing forward," Thorne said firmly. "We're not done yet." For the first time in hours, the crew of the Dominus allowed themselves a brief breath of relief. The Dominus had proven its power, and humanity had taken a stand. But this was only the beginning. The true test was yet to come. The Dominus had struck a powerful blow, but the galaxy was still on the edge of war. The Xorath would return, and when they did, humanity would be ready. Betrayal within. The battle was far from over, but the crew of the Dominus had a brief moment of respite as they continued their pursuit of the retreating Xorath fleet. Captain Thorne stood on the bridge, his eyes focused on the scanner, watching as the enemy ships retreated into the darkness of space. They had dealt a heavy blow to the Xorath, but they knew this wasn't the end. "Maintain alert status," Thorne commanded, his voice sharp. "We don't know if they're regrouping or just pulling back to reassess. Keep the shields up and weapons ready." The crew responded with the usual professionalism, but Thorne could feel something was off. It wasn't just the battle fatigue or the intensity of the fight. It was a gut feeling. Something wasn't right. He turned to Mara, his lieutenant and most trusted officer, who was standing at her station, her eyes flickering over the data. "Mara, have you noticed anything unusual?" Thorne asked, his voice quieter now. She glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "Not really, Captain. The fleet is still active, but the Xorath are falling back in an organized fashion. They're regrouping, not running. But it's strange. There's something off about their movements. It doesn't feel like a retreat." Thorne rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't place it. Maybe the Xorath were planning a counterattack, or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Suddenly, The alarms blared across the bridge, cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Alert! Security breach on Deck 7. One of the crew members shouted. Panic spread quickly through the crew. Security breaches were rare on the Dominus. It was a ship built for defense, and the crew was handpicked for their loyalty and skill. Thorne's heart sank. Mara, check the logs. See if there's any unusual activity or unauthorized access. Mara's fingers flew over the controls as she accessed the ship's security systems. Her face grew pale as the data came in. Captain, I don't believe it. Someone has overridden the security codes. They've gained access to restricted areas of the ship. The room fell silent. A traitor on their ship. Seal off Deck 7. Lock down all access points, Thorne ordered, trying to mask the anger that was building in him. Do a full sweep of the ship. No one goes anywhere until we find out who's behind this. The tension in the air was palpable as the crew scrambled to carry out the orders. Thorne's mind raced. A traitor was the last thing they needed, especially with the Xoreth still out there. They had just won a crucial battle, and now someone on board was working against them. As the security teams moved to secure Deck 7, Thorne stepped off the bridge, his footsteps echoing down the metal corridors. The feeling of betrayal weighed heavily on him. The Dominus was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's last stand. How could someone betray that? He thought of the crew, the people who had stood with him through thick and thin, and a knot tightened in his stomach. He reached Deck 7, where the breach had occurred. The security team was already in place, but there was no sign of the intruder. The room was eerily quiet, and Thorne's eyes scanned the area carefully. Something wasn't adding up. He could feel it in the air. Captain, one of the officers called out, their voice trembling. We found something. Thorne turned, his heart racing. The officer held up a small device, an encrypted data pad, one that wasn't authorized for anyone outside of the command staff to use. It had been left behind in a small compartment. The device was active, and the data was still fresh. Thorne took the pad, his fingers brushing over the screen. He quickly scanned through the information. His blood ran cold. The pad contained encrypted communications, orders from someone within the Dominus to sabotage the mission. It was clear. The traitor had been working with the Xoreth, feeding them crucial intelligence about the Dominus and its capabilities. The betrayal was deep, far more than a simple act of sabotage. This was treason. Whoever did this, they're planning to destroy everything we've worked for. Thorne muttered to himself. The weight of the situation hit him hard. This was more than a security breach. It was an act of war from within their own ranks. He looked around at his officers. We have a mole on this ship. Someone who's been working with the Xoreth. We need to find them. Now. But the question remained, who could it be? Who among the crew, trusted by Thorne and the rest, could betray them like this? And why? As the crew began their search for the traitor, Thorne couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Someone was watching him. Someone close. But no one seemed to have any idea who it was. Every time Thorne passed a crew member, he wondered if they were the ones who had sold them out. Back on the bridge, Lieutenant Morrow worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the data from the device with personnel records. There were no immediate answers, but one thing was clear. The traitor knew the Dominus's every move. Their plans were compromised. Captain, I think I may have found something, Mara said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. There's a crew member who's been accessing sensitive areas of the ship without clearance, and their name keeps coming up in the encrypted files. Thorne's heart sank as Mara continued reading the data aloud. It's Commander Rylus. He's been in communication with the Xoreth. It looks like he's been feeding them information about the ship's systems, the weapons, even our movements. We've been infiltrated from the inside. Rylus was one of the most respected officers aboard the Dominus. He had been with Thorne since the beginning, a close friend and a trusted leader in the fleet. But now, everything Thorne thought he knew about him was called into question. Prepare a team to apprehend Rylus, Thorn ordered, his voice cold. "We cannot let him destroy everything we fought for." As the search for Rylus began, Thorn knew this was the moment that would test the crew's loyalty. The Dominus was humanity's last hope, and now they were fighting not just the Exoreth, but a traitor in their midst. Time was running out, and Thorn wasn't sure who could be trusted anymore. But one thing was certain: he would do whatever it took to protect the Dominus and the future of humanity. The last stand. The crew of the Dominus was on edge. The betrayal had shaken them to their core, and the sense of camaraderie that had once bound them together now felt fragile. Captain Thorn stood on the bridge, his mind constantly racing. Commander Rylus, once a close confidant, was still at large, and every moment spent searching for him was a moment that Xoreth could use to regroup and strike again. The stakes had never been higher. "Captain, the Xoreth have regrouped," Lieutenant Mara called, her voice tight with urgency. "They're not retreating anymore. They're preparing for a full-scale assault on our position. We can't waste any more time hunting down Rylus. We have to fight." Thorn's jaw clenched as he looked at the view screen. The enemy fleet had gathered once again, more formidable than ever. Their ships were enormous, and the sheer number of them was overwhelming. The Dominus was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. Even with all of humanity's technological advancements, they were still vastly outnumbered. "We're not backing down," Thorn said, his voice cold and commanding. "Prepare for the final engagement. Rylus can wait. We fight now, or we risk losing everything." The Dominus powered up its weapons, its massive engines thrumming with energy. The crew moved into position, ready to give everything they had. There would be no second chances. The Xoreth fleet advanced, their warships closing in on the Dominus with terrifying speed. Their weapons were already charging, and the first volley of missiles streaked toward them. "Brace for impact," Thorn ordered. The Dominus rocked as the first wave of Xoreth missiles slammed into its shields, causing the entire ship to shudder. The shield generators hummed under the strain, but they held. The crew held their breath. They had no choice but to push forward. "Return fire," Thorn shouted. The Dominus's guns fired back with pinpoint precision. The energy blasts from the warship lit up the dark expanse of space, tearing through Xoreth ships with brutal force. But the Xoreth were relentless, and their numbers seemed to multiply as more and more ships poured into the fray. "Captain, we're being flanked," Mara called. "The Xoreth are surrounding us on all sides." Thorn's mind raced as he thought of a strategy. The Dominus was a fortress, but it wasn't designed to be surrounded on all sides. They had to break out, find a way to turn the tide. "We need to split their forces," Thorn said, his voice calm but firm. "Target their command ships. If we take out their leadership, the rest of their fleet will fall into disarray. Aim for their flagships. Don't give them time to regroup." The crew quickly adjusted their targeting systems, locking onto the Xoreth flagships. The Dominus roared to life, its weapons firing in rapid succession. The blasts from the Dominus hit their mark, causing massive explosions on the Xoreth command ships. One by one, the Xoreth flagships began to fall. But the Xoreth weren't backing down. They fought with the fury of a species that had known nothing but conquest. Their warships pressed closer, their energy cannons blazing. The Dominus was taking heavy fire now, its shields faltering with each passing moment. "Shields at 30%, Captain," one of the crew members reported, their voice strained. "We can't keep this up much longer." "Keep fighting," Thorn barked. "We can't stop now." The Dominus surged forward, its massive engines pushing it into the heart of the Xoreth fleet. It was a dangerous maneuver, but they had no choice. They were too close to losing. "Captain," Mara shouted from her station, her eyes wide with alarm. "We've detected a massive energy buildup on one of the Xoreth capital ships. It's charging up something huge, like nothing we've seen before." Thorn's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. The Xoreth had developed a new weapon, one that could decimate entire fleets. If they fired that weapon, it could be the end for the Dominus. All hands, brace for impact. Thorn ordered. Prepare the Dominus for evasive maneuvers. We need to avoid that shot. The crew scrambled to follow his commands, but it was clear that the odds were not in their favor. The massive energy beam was already charging. The Xorath were preparing to fire. Suddenly, a loud crackling sound filled the command center as a voice came over the intercom. It was Rylus. The traitor had been listening all along. "Captain," Rylus's voice was smooth and cold, "you were always too naive. The Dominus was never meant to win. The Xorath will destroy you, and I will be there to see it. I've made sure of it." Thorn's blood ran cold. Rylus had been right under their noses the entire time. It was too late to stop him now. "That's enough, Rylus," Thorn growled. "You've made your choice." But Rylus was already gone, and his treachery had ensured the Xorath's victory. The Dominus was in the firing line. As the Xorath ship's weapon continued to charge, a moment of clarity struck Thorn. There was one chance, a last-ditch maneuver that could give them a shot at survival. The Dominus's experimental warp drive could be used to evade the incoming blast. It was a long shot, but it was the only option left. "Prepare the warp drive," Thorn ordered, his voice steady even though he could feel the weight of what was to come. "We're going to make this our final stand." The crew quickly made preparations, pulling the ship into position. The Dominus's engines roared to life as the experimental warp drive powered up. It was risky, untested in such a high-stress situation, but it was their only hope. With the Xorath weapon charging up for its final strike, Thorn gave the order. "Now, warp drive, engage." The Dominus surged forward, its massive form flickering and shifting as the warp drive activated. The world around them twisted and stretched, and in a flash, the Dominus disappeared, just as the Xorath weapon fired. The Xorath weapon's blast collided with empty space, where the Dominus had been moments before. The Xorath flagship's energy weapon exploded in the wake of its own failed strike. The Dominus had escaped, barely. But the battle was far from over. The Dominus had survived, but there was no certainty that humanity would win this war. The Xorath would return, and they would not forget the defiance that the humans had shown. As Captain Thorn stood at the bridge, he knew one thing. The fight was not over. It had only just begun. A new dawn. The Dominus drifted through the silence of space, its hull battered and scarred from the fierce battle that had just unfolded. Captain Thorn stood at the helm, eyes scanning the void in front of him. The crew was silent, their exhaustion palpable, but there was a sense of relief in the air. They had survived, against all odds. The Xorath's weapon had failed, their retreat had begun, and the Dominus had managed to escape, but it came at a heavy cost. The crew had proven their strength, but now the reality of what lay ahead settled in. The Xorath would regroup, they would learn from their mistakes, and they would return. Humanity had taken its first step into the larger galaxy, but the road ahead was uncertain, full of danger and challenges. "Captain," Mara said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "We've made it. The Xorath, they've retreated. But we're not done yet, are we?" Thorn met her gaze. "No, this is just the beginning." The crew, battered but unbroken, had faced the Xorath and survived. But there was a deeper understanding now. Humanity was no longer the forgotten species in the galaxy. The Dominus had shown the universe what humans were capable of: resilience, ingenuity, and the will to fight back against impossible odds. They had taken a stand. The Dominus's engines hummed quietly as it moved through the stars. They were headed to the nearest human colony, the last safe haven. But Captain Thorn knew that even now, as they left the battle behind them, the Xorath were regrouping. They would come for Earth next. They had to prepare. "We've gained time," Thorn said, his voice resolute. "We've shown the galaxy that humanity will not be easily defeated. But we can't rest. The war is far from over. We need to be ready for the next battle. Mara nodded. What's our plan, Captain? First, we need to secure the support of the other galactic factions. We need allies. The Xoreth are not just a threat to humanity, they're a threat to everyone. If we stand together, we have a chance. But we need to act quickly. We need to show that the Dominus is just the beginning. The Dominus had proven its worth in battle, but now humanity had to take the next step. They had to rally the galaxy behind them, form alliances, and prepare for the war that was still to come. The Xoreth would not rest until they had crushed every resistance, but humanity would not be easily broken. The journey to victory would be long and hard, but the first spark had been lit. The Dominus had survived its trial by fire, and humanity had shown that they could fight for their future. As the ship continued to glide through the stars, Thorn couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. But there was a sense of purpose now, a sense of pride in his crew. The Dominus was their shield, but it was their unity, their determination, that would carry them forward. Captain, a voice called from behind him. It was Lieutenant Mura, her expression serious but filled with resolve. The Xoreth may have retreated, but they'll be back. And when they do, we'll be ready. Thorn turned, a glint of determination in his eyes. You're right. And when they return, we'll show them the true power of humanity. We will not be afraid. Not anymore. The Dominus had survived its first battle, but the war was just beginning. And this time, humanity would not be forgotten. The galaxy would soon know the strength of Earth's people, and they would not stop fighting until the Xoreth had been defeated and peace had been restored. As the Dominus sailed through the stars, heading toward an uncertain future, one thing was clear. Humanity's story was far from over. The dawn of a new era had begun, and it would be one written by the hands of those who refused to surrender. The war for the galaxy had only just begun.